Welcome to American Aftermath. Tonight we'll trace the entire story of 9/11. A Tuesday that should have passed like any other became a day when nearly 3,000 lives were taken. Landmark towers collapsed into dust, and a country that thought itself distant from war learned how fragile that feeling truly was. We will stay close to the people who lived it and to the quiet ways it still shapes American life. Before we begin, if you find comfort retellings of the days that broke and reshaped America, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. Now, dim the lights, settle back, and let the rest of the day drift away while we ease into tonight's story. In the years before 9/11, the ordinary pace of American life felt solid and familiar. Flights were routine errands stitched between work, family, and leisure. Airports looked like civic spaces where people waited at the gate with relatives and waved as boarding began. Security lines were present, but quick, and mostly about moving metal objects into plastic trays. Few imagined a civilian jet used as a weapon. Intelligence threats existed, yet the wider culture expected safety at home. News focused on politics, business, and sports more than looming catastrophe. That confidence shaped habits in federal offices, airline training rooms, and living rooms, setting the stage for what followed. For years. At most airports, travel felt personable and loose around the edges. Families could walk through the concourse without boarding passes, linger at windows, and greet arrivals at the jet bridge. Children pointed at planes while agents printed paper boarding cards and tore stubs. Carry-on bags held drinks, toiletries, and pocket items that would later be screened out. Shoes stayed on. Laptops, when present, stayed in their sleeves. The search for weapons focused on obvious shapes and obvious metal. The mood was courtesy over suspicion. People hurried to make flights, but almost no one planned around long lines. That light touch saved minutes and hid what would become risk. For travelers, screening was usually performed by private contractors paid by airlines under federal rules. The Federal Aviation Administration wrote standards, inspected airports, and issued circulars, yet daily performance varied from place to place. Pay was low and turnover high. Many workers learned by repetition rather than long instruction. Checkpoints relied on X-ray images, magnetometers, and hand wands when needed. Supervisors balanced speed with caution while managers watched wait times. The customer was the passenger and the airline, not a new federal agency. Near misses were treated as lessons and as embarrassments. The wider expectation held steady. Flights should depart on time. Security should be visible, quick, and largely uneventful daily. Airline crews trained for hijackings that would end on a runway, not in a building. The priority was to keep passengers calm and land the aircraft where negotiators could work. Cockpit doors were lightweight and often open in flight for routine movement. Pilots managed safety and hospitality together. Military defenses watched the horizon for threats coming from outside the borders. Timelines for scrambling fighters were built for rare events and specific air defense zones. Controllers could call the military, but hijack procedures assumed time to talk. The playbook had worked for decades. It pointed to patience, to transponders, to coded notices, and to pilots who would follow instructions under strain. Inside the intelligence world, Agencies had strong missions that ran beside each other. The CIA worked abroad. The FBI worked inside the country. Analysts and agents shared information through formal channels that could be slow. Rules built after earlier abuses shaped how leads moved. Databases were separate and staff held clearances that did not always align. Counter-terror teams worked hard, yet the system encouraged caution and process. In briefings, threats were serious, but the path from fragment to action was winding. Coordination happened, though often through personal trust rather than shared platforms. The result was skill without smoothness, effort without speed, and a sense that time remained for careful deliberation. Beyond the horizon of most daily life, a network planned violence far from television comfort. Al-Qaeda grew through the 1990s as conflicts and training camps produced recruits and leaders. The attacks on embassies in East Africa and the bombing of a Navy ship signaled reach and intent. Investigations traced names and money through distant cities. For many Americans, these were stories from overseas. The urgent work sat with specialists while ordinary days carried on. Stadiums filled. Highways stayed crowded. Airports kept selling tickets and coffee. The sense of distance was real. There was grief and anger. Yet it did not translate into a belief that home would change soon. New York in that era lived by work, transit, and an appetite for scale. The World Trade Center anchored Lower Manhattan with wide plazas and tall lobbies where badge checks were routine, and tourists rode elevators for the view. Financial firms, brokers, insurers, and service crews turned mornings into a timed dance. Coffee carts steamed near subway stairways. Fire companies reviewed maps of high rises and drilled for stairwell evacuations. The buildings had fireproofing, alarms, and procedures built from earlier fires and lessons. People trusted those measures and trusted each other to follow them. The towers were landmarks and workplaces, not imagined as targets in the middle of a Tuesday. Washington moved on its own rhythm of briefings, budgets, and long hallways. The Pentagon was a daily workplace with cafeterias, copy rooms, and watch centers that ran without pause. The building held history and routine. Military planning focused on deployments, alliances, and watch lists abroad. Base gates screened cars with standard checks. Flights out of Reagan National skimmed the river and turned in tight patterns to respect the restricted core. Officials read memos about threats, yet their schedules were crowded with the practical needs of management. The city understood risk in a general way and managed it as part of normal life. Calm professionalism was the standing posture most days. Airlines competed through hub networks, frequent flyer tiers, and price calendars that rewarded early planners. Deregulation had aged into a stable map of carriers large and small. Flight attendants practiced medical skills, crowd management, and clear announcements. Pilots balanced schedules with airmanship and weather briefings. Crews trained to de-escalate conflict and to treat hijackers as criminals who wanted leverage. That approach had a logic grounded in past events. If a crew kept order, everyone might go home after a long delay. Passengers absorbed that belief through news and safety cards. The guiding story matched experience. It was a story about restraint, patience, and landing at the nearest field safely. Air traffic controllers worked headsets and scopes in windowed towers and in quiet radar rooms. They sequenced departures, managed en route flows, and handed flights across sectors with practiced clarity. Emergencies happened, but most involved weather or mechanical alerts and ended with safe returns. When a pilot code signaled a hijack, the assumption in the written steps was a diversion to an airfield. Military coordination existed, yet the watch for threats centered on the coasts and the high Arctic. Exercises and plans used past models. People were ready for trouble they had seen, not for a sudden pattern that would ask for speed no one yet expected on that morning. Daily communication carried a different texture before smartphones became central. People used landlines, pagers, and early cell phones with short battery life. Email lived on desktops at the office and on dial-up at home. News arrived through morning television, radio, and printed papers left on stoops. Maps were folded in glove boxes. Cameras used film unless you had an early digital model. The culture of constant recording did not yet exist. When urgent news broke, people gathered around a screen or a radio rather than a personal feed. That meant speed and rumor moved differently. It also meant that shared attention felt focused when a story turned for everyone. The cultural memory of earlier hijackings pulled people toward patience. Crews and passengers understood the script that said, "Stay calm, do not provoke, and wait for authorities to take control." Stories from the 70s and 80s ended with tense landings and long negotiations. Insurance, liability, and training all reinforced that plan. Many of the policies were updated, yet the core idea held. This expectation would matter when 9/11 changed the logic. The first minutes on any plane are filled with small choices and small readings of risk. People try to do the right thing. That instinct leaned toward restraint. It leaned toward believing that landing would remain the goal still. In city departments, training calendars worked through fires, medical calls, and building incidents that happen every week. Dispatchers learned to move units efficiently across crowded streets. New York firefighters trained for high-rise fires with heavy gear and long climbs. Police reviewed bomb threats and station protection shaped by the memory of earlier attacks. Hospitals prepared for surges using drills that tracked beds, blood, and teams. Communication tools relied on radios that could be overloaded during large events. Mutual aid plans linked neighboring towns and counties. The system was capable and proud. It was also designed around probable events. That focus kept resources ready and limited imagination about extremes then. Workplaces expected openness and ease. Visitors signed in, but most lobbies felt like public space. Office towers used badges for access during business hours, then relaxed procedures for deliveries and contractors. Universities welcomed international students and scholars into labs and lecture halls. The country valued travel as a bridge, not as a risk to be minimized. That spirit extended to aviation, where customer service and on-time performance measured success. Political arguments were sharp, yet the idea of a mass casualty strike at home felt remote. That distance would be challenged by 9/11, which would shift the meaning of normal. People would revisit habits that once felt harmless and routine. All of these patterns formed the stage on which danger could move without drawing much attention. In the years preceding 9/11, Warnings rose and fell inside agencies and inside Allied capitals. Reports suggested intention and training, yet the everyday picture still looked steady. That contrast kept the wider public unaware that the ground was shifting. As September 11th approached, fragments of intelligence pointed to aviation and to coordinated plans. The clues did not cohere fast enough to change routines. When September 11th arrived, the habits of the era met a new kind of attack. The feeling of safety would break, and the slow build would end as the story surged forward. In the months leading into September 11th, the United States moved through a summer of warnings that felt both urgent and strangely distant. Travelers planned vacations, students worked summer jobs, and offices watched budgets while brief reports mentioned plots without a clear date. Inside agencies, some analysts felt the tempo rising, yet the system moved through forms and briefings that made speed difficult. Airlines kept schedules full, stadiums filled under skies, and mornings began with coffee and routine. The warnings did not tell people how life might change. That gap between urgency and clarity shaped choices across the season. The country was attentive, but not ready for what was coming. Soon, one sign came from Phoenix, where an agent suggested a canvass of flight schools after noticing students whose interests seemed mismatched with ordinary pilot careers. The memo described patterns, proposed outreach to training centers, and asked for names to be checked. It moved through channels, logged and discussed, but did not spark a nationwide surge. Supervisors weighed resources and competing leads. The note lived in a stack, important but not dramatic. It asked for methodical work that would have taken time in any season. Aviation felt safe to most people. The idea of plots using planes as weapons still sounded unlikely to many ears. Momentum never gathered around that request. Another sign came in Minnesota, where a flight school raised alarms about a student who wanted to learn to fly a big jet without learning to land. Agents detained him, sought warrants, and tried to open digital files that might reveal contacts. The legal thresholds were high and the paperwork exacting. Conversations bounced between offices about probable cause and rules for foreign intelligence. The field sensed urgency and asked for help. Headquarters measured risk against standards and time. The moment passed without a decisive breakthrough. In the light of 9/11, those days looked painfully close to a critical door that would not open. People felt the cliff but lacked footing. In earlier years, 2 names had entered files after a meeting abroad that linked veterans of jihad to future plans. One traveled to California with a companion and lived openly under their own names. A photocopy of a passport, a recorded meeting, and scattered cables built a thin trail that did not reach every desk. The men found apartments, flight lessons, and quiet support. Later, a watch list notice finally went out, and agents began looking inside the country. The timing was late. Field offices searched with fragments, not an address. After September 11th, those notes read like red flags that never reached the right hands in time. For many, heartbreaking. Throughout that summer, fragments pointed toward a large attack, though the place and method stayed vague. Reports spoke of spectacles, of coordinated timing, and of urgency inside messages that moved through safe houses and couriers. Briefings reached senior officials who pressed for disruption overseas and alerts at home. The FAA issued circulars that highlighted hijacking as a renewed concern. Airports adjusted posture slightly and urged vigilance without alarming travelers. Analysts struggled to convert heat into shape. The idea of planes used as weapons remained contested across offices. By September 11th, the surface of daily life still looked unchanged. For most people, the threat felt far away. Yet signals kept pulsing. On an August morning, a daily brief from the president carried a title about a leader determined to strike inside the country. It summarized history, methods, and interest in hijacking. It noted patterns of surveillance and names already familiar to specialists. The document did not provide a date or a city. It read as a warning rooted in years of plotting rather than a last-hour alarm. Staff waited amid many demands and continued pressure on networks overseas. At desks across government, summer moved along in measured steps. After September 11th, that page became a touchstone in public debate about what was known and how decisions were made and weighed. Across senior circles, briefers spoke of a threat environment that felt intense and persistent. Counter-terror leaders pressed for action in countries where training camps operated and where facilitators moved money and people. Inside meetings, the language grew urgent as fragments kept arriving. The sense was that something significant was coming. The question was where and when. Domestic agencies tightened posture in small ways and watched for anomalies. Travel alerts and background checks expanded within existing rules. The drumbeat did not translate into a single, shared picture of what to stop. In the story that leads to 9/11, that gap between heat and focus becomes the defining hinge for the summer. Within aviation, circulars warned of heightened risk and urged checkpoints to treat knives and box cutters with attention, even when rules allowed small blades. Supervisors reminded crews to watch for unusual behavior and to report attempts to test procedures. A limited program of air marshals existed, but seats were few and routes broad. Cockpit doors remained light and unlocked in flight for normal movement. Training still emphasized calm diversion and patience. Airlines balanced caution with customer experience. Gate agents kept lines moving. Security contractors worked long shifts under pay scales that made turnover constant. Looking back through September 11th, these measures seemed thin against what was building just out of sight. In New York, the towers stood in steady routine as office workers moved through turnstiles and lobbies that felt familiar. Building staff managed badges, freight, and tenant needs with practiced rhythm. Fire wardens reviewed floor plans and evacuation routes. Drills taught people to wait for announcements and to use stairwells in order. The city had lived through a bombing years earlier, yet daily life returned to confidence. The Emergency Management Office watched weather, parades, and security notes for major events. Radios were tested. Maps were updated. The idea of a catastrophic aviation strike did not guide planning. When 9/11 arrived, the city would lean on habits made for different dangers. In Washington, the rhythm of policy work carried urgency of its own. The Pentagon tracked deployments and watched distant regions where attacks had occurred in earlier years. Intelligence staff briefed principals with charts, names, and evolving assessments. Exercises anticipated threats from abroad that would cross borders in known ways. Domestic air defense posture assumed rare hijacks that would land somewhere for negotiation. There was no expectation of airliners turned into missiles. The National Capital Region had restrictions on flight paths, yet enforcement tools were narrow and timelines long. Through the lens of 9/11, the summer frame shows strong tools for old patterns and thin preparation for a different script entirely. Television news followed the thread of global terrorism while also carrying daily politics, business, and sports. Morning shows mixed interviews with lifestyle segments. Newspapers ran pieces about security alongside stories on markets and education. The summer did not feel like a countdown to a specific day. Talk radio debated policy more than procedures. In cities and suburbs, people focused on family milestones, moves, and school plans. The fear of something large was present in specialized talk, not in ordinary conversation. The nation had not experienced an attack of that scale at home in living memory. Without a shared date, the warnings drifted like weather that might miss the shore again. At the level of daily life, crews and passengers moved through patterns they trusted. Pilots briefed weather and fuel. Flight attendants checked galleys and counted seats. Agents issued standby passes and rerouted families. A few incidents hinted at probing behavior that felt odd but not decisive. A bag left unattended drew attention, then returned to its owner with apologies. A passenger refused to sit until a supervisor intervened. Each story ended quietly and seemed to confirm routine. The next day looked the same. Seen through September 11th, these vignettes feel like still frames from a road that was narrowing, even as most travelers believed it remained wide. For them, normal held. Coordination across agencies depended on radios, phone trees, and personal relationships built over years of shared work. Interoperability was limited, especially between police, fire, and federal teams that used different systems. Exercises practiced responses to storms, chemical releases, and bomb threats. The focus was practical and local. Plans assumed access to incident scenes by road. High-rise procedures emphasized stair control and medical staging. Mutual aid compacts existed, yet real-time communication still faltered during stress. Looking back with 9/11 in mind, the gaps appear stark. At the time, they felt manageable risks inside a busy city that dealt with daily emergencies and moved on after each one, most days. In households across the country, summer unfolded with familiar markers. A daughter packed for college and bought a small fan for a dorm. A pilot celebrated a birthday with a backyard barbecue and a short flight the next day. A firefighter finished a night tour, kissed his sleeping children, and rode home past a skyline he knew by heart. An immigrant family received a long-awaited visa and planned a first visit to an observation deck. A new employee worked in a lower-floor office and learned phone extensions by hand. Nothing felt fragile. The season asked for attention only in small ways, not in life-changing ones, for anyone. By early September, the weather turned crisp in the northeast and humid across the south. Schools reopened. Commuters found their rhythm again. In offices, calendars filled with meetings after summer vacations. Airports watched Labor Day traffic thin out. Construction cranes dotted skylines. People set alarms for an ordinary Tuesday. They laid out clothes and charged phones. They arranged childcare and thought about dinner. In New York, the sky would be clear and blue. In Washington, the commute would be normal. Over the country, airliners waited at gates with doors open and jetways attached. The season of warnings had ended. The morning that would change everything was near. Quiet and close, on the morning of September 11th, the first hours opened with clear blue over the northeast and a steady commute into New York and Washington. Subways and buses emptied into sidewalks. Coffee steamed from carts and break rooms. At airports, jetways hummed as crews finished checks and passengers slid bags into overhead space. Controllers watched scopes and gave simple clearances in a rhythm they knew by heart. In lower Manhattan, the towers caught the light and cast long shadows across the plaza. At the Pentagon, workers tapped badges and settled into early meetings. Nothing about the sky suggested disaster. The day felt ordinary in a way that made attention relax. Inside each plane, the tone was quiet. Seatbelts clicked and tray tables rose. The promise of a short flight or a long connection shaped small plans. Across those minutes, the choices made in training and habit held steady. Routine covered danger that had already boarded. Every signal felt normal to eyes tuned by long calm. During September 11th, the first break in routine appeared as a missed radio call and a course that drifted from its filed path. Controllers tried again and marked the transponder change with a note that meant uncertainty. On the flight deck, the door was light and movement inside the cabin stayed quiet enough to hide intent. Passengers felt only a turn and a change in speed. In New York, the workday continued while a silent emergency unfolded miles away. Firehouses checked rigs. Offices filled. Television anchors read headlines about politics and markets. Then a roar crossed the morning and drew eyes upward. A jet crossed the harbor and struck the North Tower high above the streets. The impact blew papers into the sky and sent shock through the city. For a moment, people tried to fit it into accident. The thought of weather or mechanical failure felt easier to hold. Dispatchers sent alarms, and first companies rolled with practiced speed toward downtown. Sirens layered over voices. In the first minutes after the strike on the North Tower, the city tried to understand what had happened. Calls poured into 911. Port Authority police and fire units converged and began staging. Elevators stopped in banks. Stair doors opened and closed as people searched for direction. The building had survived a bombing years earlier and had plans for fire response. Announcements asked for calm and guided people toward exits that were still passable. Some floors filled with smoke while others remained clear and bright. Across the river, cameras began to carry the image live. The country watched a wound in real time and reached for accident as the explanation. The date would later be said in full. In that moment, people felt the meaning without the words. Far to the south, another jet turned toward the city unnoticed by most eyes focused on downtown. On September 11th, the span between confusion and recognition lasted only brief, tense minutes. Those minutes shaped later memories. The second strike ended doubt. A southbound jet curved into view and impacted the South Tower with violent force that left no room for accident. Fire and debris fell across streets and rooftops. The shock rippled through offices and living rooms as people realized the city was under attack. Reporters began to speak with a different tone. Officials moved command posts and drew tighter perimeters. In the towers, those who could move began down while others waited for help. Radios filled with overlapping calls as units climbed. In Washington, watch officers and senior leaders understood that a coordinated threat was in motion. Airports scanned gates and runways for anomalies. The air traffic system began to reroute flights and look hard at each blip. The morning of September 11th had become a national emergency in plain view. Phones rang in the White House and at the FAA headquarters. Military liaisons conferred with civil authorities. A sense of acceleration took hold as each minute brought new information fast. Within the North Tower, smoke moved through damaged shafts while some stairwells stayed passable. People formed lines and helped one another through doors that stuck from heat. Fire wardens guided groups toward the stairs and kept elevators clear for rescue. On higher floors, the conditions were worse, and choices narrowed to windows, phones, and prayers for help that might reach them. In the South Tower, evacuation began on many levels even before official orders spread. Others waited, unsure about the safest path. Calls home carried the date, September 11th, into kitchens nationwide as voices tried to steady loved ones. Firefighters arrived, staged, and started up with heavy gear that turned each flight into a test. Police officers joined to manage exits and secure perimeters below. The city began to move as one body, street by street, floor by floor, with courage that felt ordinary because it was shared. On September 11th, the measure of bravery was simple action taken together. It filled hallways and stairwells everywhere. In Washington, the pattern of calls shifted from concern to urgency as radar tracks raised alarms. National defense officials sought clarity while controllers tried to separate rumor from fact. The air defense posture was built for threats from outside the borders. Yet the moving danger now came from inside domestic airspace. As minutes passed, a jet approached the Capitol. Drivers on highways saw the low sweep of wings and a flash of impact at the Pentagon. Flames rose from alongside of the building and dark smoke bent over the river. Inside, workers evacuated, helped the injured, and established command in outdoor spaces. Fire crews from nearby jurisdictions arrived quickly and began to attack the blaze. On September 11th, the nation now faced simultaneous crises in two cities tied by air and by shock. Leaders moved to secure sites, adjust continuity plans, and keep communications stable. Roads closed near federal buildings. The city absorbed the blow and kept working with sober focus through the afternoon. Across the air system, the need to slow the sky became clear. Controllers coordinated with supervisors and began to hold departures at major hubs. Pilots asked questions and received swift instructions to land at the nearest suitable airport. The order to clear the skies spread in minutes and became the largest rapid grounding in aviation history. Flights diverted to unfamiliar fields where crews and passengers navigated uncertainty with patience. In towers and centers, people marked strips, recalculated paths, and kept voices steady. The work was intense and concentrated. In those rooms, the scale of the day was measured in aircraft identifiers and in tired eyes that would not look away. On September 11th, the air became quiet in a way no one had experienced. That silence was work. It was also a shield that reduced the number of moving pieces as other dangers came into view. Emergency managers lined up buses, medics, and staging areas while hospitals activated surge plans. City networks strained but largely held. Information reached the public through live images and short statements that tried to balance speed and accuracy. Rumors grew alongside verified facts until officials corrected them. Washington offices near the mall evacuated and formed lines on sidewalks before moving farther out. The White House grounds cleared. Staff relocated to secure spaces where phones and radios could be managed under strain. Across the region, federal workers helped one another find rides and shelter. Senior leaders traveled to command centers and airborne platforms to ensure continuity. The aim was simple: keep the government functioning while cities fought fires and searched for survivors. On September 11th, that balance between visibility and protection required judgment made in seconds. The nation watched leaders speak in brief remarks that promised action and care. The words were measured and somber. The effort behind them was vast and human, built from teams who knew their roles and carried them out under pressure. They kept essential systems running even as uncertainty tested every plan made. On the streets of Lower Manhattan, dust and paper traveled with the wind while people evacuated on foot toward the north and toward the rivers. Police set up corridors and directed traffic away from danger. Bridges and tunnels were managed with caution as the city tried to balance access for emergency vehicles with the need to move civilians out. Ferries and private boats began to carry people across the water in a steady stream. Hospitals prepared operating rooms and triage zones. Blood banks saw long lines as volunteers tried to help. The scale of the injuries would not match the generosity, but the impulse mattered. On September 11th, the instinct to give and to carry remained constant. Fire and smoke kept rising from the towers as companies climbed and command tried to track locations. Radios strained under the load. Choices inside the buildings were shaped by heat, damage, and the desire to reach others. Stairwells narrowed momentum and turned minutes into effort and patience for everyone. Across the country, offices, schools, and homes gathered around televisions and radios as pictures from New York and Washington filled the day. Parents left work to reach children. Airports emptied. The stock exchanges paused. Mayors and governors spoke to steady their cities. In the air traffic system, the remaining flights found runways and taxied to remote ramps where crews met law enforcement and airport staff. Reporters moved with care near the perimeters and relayed the work of firefighters and medics who kept climbing and treating. On September 11th, that shared attention formed a single national room. The mood was quiet and alert. The hours ahead would carry more loss and more proof of endurance. For the people in the towers and in the Pentagon, the next acts would involve stairwells, fire lines, and command under stress. The phase that began with impact would turn toward survival and rescue as the morning kept moving. Choices made together should open paths down and out to life for many. During September 11th, the towers became vast stairwells where ordinary people found a way down. Inside, alarms sounded, lights glowed, and voices on intercoms tried to settle fear. Some floors were clear, while others filled with smoke that scratched throats and narrowed sight. People gathered at stair doors and learned quickly that patience and pace would decide survival. Those who could walk began stepping down in lines, steady and polite even under strain. Others paired up with co-workers to guide colleagues with injuries toward a possible exit. Security staff held doors, pointed to the best route, and urged people to keep moving. Phone calls reached families and passed along calm words that covered rising worry. Elevators were unreliable, and the rule was simple. Take the stairs if you can. In offices close to damage, doors jammed, ceilings fell, and hallways filled with dust. People shared water and stayed together downstairs, quietly. In the North Tower, many heard instructions that urged them to remain on their floors. Others heard different words and chose to go. Confusion traveled unevenly because speakers and alarms worked better in some areas than in others. Stairwells A and B stayed passable below the strike, though smoke and water slowed movement. Doors were heavy and sometimes locked from the stair side, and people tried multiple entries. On some floors, people with wheelchairs or injuries needed help that took strength and time. Co-workers improvised carriers from chairs and belts and moved together down each landing. Firefighters coming up paused to guide groups and to clear path where debris blocked corners. Police officers worked on lower levels to steer arrivals toward safe exits and triage. In the South Tower, the second impact created complex conditions that varied drastically by floor. Many started down while others waited for friends nearby today. As 9/11 unfolded, the stairwells became streams of steady human resolve. People held rails, counted flights, and spoke softly to keep nerves from rising. Breathing was work, and shared cloths over mouths helped a little when smoke thickened. Sprinklers ran on many floors and cooled hallways while creating slippery steps that demanded focus. A few people were carried by teams who refused to leave co-workers behind. Managers counted heads and checked restrooms, then joined the line like everyone else. Phone batteries faded, yet messages moved from floor to floor through simple words of direction. Please keep right. Water ahead. Help is coming. The stairs are clear below. That style of talk carried warmth without panic and saved energy for the descent. Each landing felt like a small goal, a pause to breathe and reset. Stair doors opened to moments of light where windows were intact and views gave courage. Onward. During September 11th, firefighters climbed with gear that weighed as much as a small child. They passed evacuees on the right and offered brief reassurances that help was on the way. Company officers checked assignments, tried to mark floors, and kept their crews together. Radio channels grew crowded and sometimes failed inside core walls where signals were weak. Chiefs set up command posts on streets, lobbies, and corners where maps and rosters could be managed. Inside, stairwell landings became staging points for brief rests and for triage. Elevator rescues continued where shafts were intact and crews could work without risking more lives. Building engineers moved through service corridors to cut power, reset systems, and help guide responders. Medical teams assembled near exits with stretchers, wheelchairs, and supplies handed forward by volunteers. Water lines snaked up stairwells where possible, though broken risers and heat challenged progress. Crews moved, refusing to surrender time. In the South Tower on September 11th, many lower floors began moving soon after the blast. Some heard a message that suggested safety above, while others heard voices urging evacuation. People who had evacuated after the first strike sometimes turned back to help co-workers. Sky lobby patterns created choke points where crowds bunched and then thinned as doors opened. In one office, a team gathered a colleague in a wheeled chair and coordinated shifts. They placed 2 in front, 2 behind, and traded positions every few flights. Firefighters met them part way and added strength for the hardest sections. In another group, a pregnant worker was escorted steadily with rests and encouragement. People carried photos, jackets, purses, and then abandoned them to free their hands. The choice to let belongings go became one more quiet act of survival. Outside, police and building staff guided the flow toward West Street, where medics waited. In the North Tower, above the impact zone, people faced choices with very few options. Some called families and described conditions to relate to emergencies below. Others searched for fresh air near windows where light offered orientation and a measure of hope. Roof access was restricted, and helicopters could not land because heat and smoke made approach impossible. People on phones listened to calm voices and tried to stay together while waiting for help. Some reached stairwell doors blocked by damage and doubled back to look for alternate routes. People used copy room water, jackets, and cloth to manage smoke and heat. They shared phone chargers and noted names for responders to find if they could not leave. The date, September 11th, carried through many calls as families tried to steady loved ones. People prayed, exchanged emails, and pressed hands together while looking toward the stairwells again. Others started down. Across both towers on September 11th, strangers formed teams quickly without waiting for orders. People translated for co-workers and relayed instructions to those unfamiliar with emergency phrasing. First aid kits appeared from desks as cuts and burns needed attention in hallways and lobbies. Some office wardens held clipboards and counted people as they cleared spaces one by one. Phones became flashlights, and small radios carried scraps of news from outside. People offered neckties as slings and used ice from break rooms to cool burns. Elevator mechanics and building staff worked beside firefighters to free trapped passengers through tight spaces. Prayers were spoken by some, while others chose quiet breathing and simple mantras. Everyone tried to keep eyes forward because looking back could break resolve. The earlier bombing had left knowledge that stairwells mattered more than elevators in crisis. Enough. As minutes stretched on, the South Tower began to fail with little warning to those inside. People in stairwells felt a long shudder, a tilt, and then a roar that erased direction. Lights vanished and dust filled space where steps had been. Those who survived described hanging onto rails and to one another as the world went dark. When the noise eased, some found pockets where air still moved and made their way out through ruins. Others were near exits and sprinted as debris chased them into streets and daylight. On September 11th, people who had paused to help often owed their lives to that exact timing. Minutes earlier meant being deeper inside. Minutes later meant being closer to open air. Firefighters and officers outside looked up, saw the shift, and shouted for people to run. They pulled strangers behind trucks and walls and lived because they chose seconds well. In the North Tower, after the South Tower fell, stairwell lines tightened but continued moving. People felt the building shake and kept voices steady to avoid panic. Some carried the injured on makeshift seats fashioned from coats and belts. Officers directed evacuees toward clear corridors and away from hazards that had appeared after the collapse. Fire commanders tried to account for companies and to find places where the injured could be treated. Radios were loaded with traffic, and many messages went unheard in the noise and complexity. Dispatchers repeated evacuations and relayed updates about perimeters and staging. Ordinary people made space for responders to pass and thanked them as they climbed. The descent felt endless yet measurable, flight by flight, landing to landing. On September 11th, a rhythm emerged that turned fear into steps and steps into survival. Then the North Tower failed, and darkness swept through stairwells and streets outside. After 9/11, survivors who reached the street moved through gray air toward light and water. Some were guided to piers where boats took them across the river. Others walked north with strangers who matched pace and offered water and phones. Shoes broke and were discarded on curbs where volunteers left new pairs in boxes. Hospital workers waited outside with masks, wheelchairs, and soft questions that checked orientation and memory. Some survivors arrived hand in hand and refused to separate during intake. Names were written on paper, then on boards, and finally on walls near stations for families. People described co-workers left behind so rescuers could search when the fire eased. In neighborhoods beyond downtown, apartments opened for washing, resting, and finding enough quiet to call home. Lines formed to give blood, and counselors stood near entrances to offer simple comfort. People recognized stairwell partners and embraced without words, right then. In the aftermath of 9/11, the lessons of the stairwells shaped training and design. Emergency plans began to emphasize full building evacuations rather than limited relocations. Offices introduced regular drills that practiced moving quickly and kindly in tight spaces. Signage improved, and doors were checked to ensure consistent re-entry from stairs to floors. Fire departments updated radio systems and added repeaters to help signals pierce dense structures. Architects studied smoke movement and lighting to keep routes understandable, even when power fails. Survivors carried memories of rails underhand and of voices that made terror manageable. Many found sleep difficult and felt startle responses in crowds or on stairs. Counselors taught breathing and grounding, tools that echoed the step-by-step rhythm of evacuation. Doctors tracked lung and heart effects for those who worked or escaped through contaminated air. Beyond these towers, another workplace faced fire and quiet courage nearby too. On September 11th, the Pentagon began its day with coffee, briefings, and the hum of a building that never sleeps. Civilians and service members scanned emails, adjusted schedules, and settled into offices along the long outer ring. The morning felt ordinary, the kind of calm that invites focus. Arlington fire units drilled, the Pentagon police watched gates, and helicopters turned near the river helipad. Across Crystal City, commuters parked and took brisk steps under a bright Virginia sky. Inside the building, renovation crews worked on reinforced sections that had only recently reopened. When the loudest sound was printers, people trusted the day to remain steady. That confidence would be tested soon. A jet approaching from the west crossed highways at low altitude and sliced into the Pentagon's outer rings. During September 11th, that strike turned offices and corridors into flame and smoke in a single breath. Windows blew inward and ceilings fell while people near the impact grabbed co-workers and pulled toward light. On the lawn, the blast wave rattled fences and threw burning debris. Fire moved through offices where maps hung and photographs marked careers. The building flexed, held, and began to breathe heavy smoke through shattered lines. Electric lights died in sections and alarms wailed as people felt heat drive choices. They looked for exits and for one another nearby. Near the helipad, a small fire crew saw the impact and drove straight toward the flames. On September 11th, those first responders used foam and water to cut a path through burning wreckage. Arlington County units arrived quickly and started command in a field near the south parking lot. Officers marked zones, set triage areas, and began to move ambulances in careful loops. Mutual aid brought engines and medic units from Alexandria, Fairfax, and the district. Military police secured perimeters while Pentagon staff guided evacuees toward open lawns away from the building. Smoke drifted low along Route 1, and firefighters worked through heat with steady discipline. Their training met the day. Inside, people near the impact zone crawled under smoke, covered mouths with cloth, and followed exit signs toward daylight. Others moved crosswise through corridors that ran like spokes, guiding colleagues who were disoriented by darkness. Some carried the injured on office chairs, trading positions every few doorways to keep pace. Security officers kept calm voices and pointed people along the simplest arrow to safety. On September 11th, the building's sheer size meant thousands had to move without panicking. Phones failed as power dropped, leaving voices as the surest guide. People opened doors, checked bathrooms, and made sure no one was left behind. Small, steady kindnesses kept fear from running ahead. On the grass near the impact, medics set tarps for triage and coordinated with hospital command. Patients arrived in waves carried by co-workers, police, and firefighters who moved with deliberate speed. Burns, smoke inhalation, and blunt injuries dominated the first hour. Doctors and nurses from nearby clinics ran to help and joined teams without ceremony. Ambulances cycled to Georgetown, Washington Hospital Center, and others while traffic control cleared corridors. Chaplain services arrived to support families and responders dealing with shock. Supply officers drew masks, gloves, and lights from caches that had been staged for routine emergencies. The work kept growing, and so did the calm that makes careful care possible. Command on September 11th formed quickly, with Arlington County Fire establishing incident leadership and integrating military and police partners. They mapped sectors, designated entry points, and created a collapse zone to keep crews safe. Liaisons kept communication steady between the Pentagon Operations Center and the scene on the lawn. Air quality, structural stability, and fire spread were tracked hour by hour. Requests flowed for foam, heavy equipment, lighten towers, and food for teams working long rotations. Status boards evolved from clipboards to grids as the scale became clear. Federal investigators were staged for later, after life safety tasks had priority. The rhythm was plan, act, reassess, then plan again with eyes. Inside the National Military Command Center, officers monitored the wider picture while the building burned along its western edge. On September 11th, they balanced support to the scene with the larger duty of national defense. Secure lines linked the Pentagon to the White House, the FAA, and combatant commands. Decisions about air patrols and restricted movement unfolded under intense time pressure. Senior leaders were moved as needed to keep continuity intact. Security posture increased around bases and federal buildings while information kept changing minute by minute. The goal never wavered: protect lives, steady the government, and understand what might still be coming. That clarity guided choices even in smoke and confusion. On lower floors, people formed lines and guided the injured through doorways splintered by force. A Marine helped carry a colleague down a staircase that felt endless in heat and smoke. A nurse from a clinic set up a small station beside a column and began simple assessments. An engineer returned twice to check dark offices and led 2 co-workers out by touch. People shared water bottles and used shirts as makeshift masks. In the courtyard, voices organized into short calls that carried over noise. Stay left, keep moving, watch the floor, follow the light ahead, help is coming. Those words kept people together when sight failed. Courage looked patient. The area under renovation had received stronger walls, new sprinkler lines, and improved egress routes. On September 11th, those changes slowed collapse, gave corridors more time, and helped crews reach deeper rooms. Even so, heat and smoke grew fast in enclosed spaces where furniture and paper fed the fire. Ventilation choices required caution to avoid pushing flames into new areas. Structural engineers joined command to read cracks, listen to movement, and advise on safe entry. Operators stood by until life-saving options were exhausted. The priority remained constant: rescue first, then suppression, then careful search. Patience under pressure kept people from rushing into places that would not hold. That discipline saved lives. Families across the region tried to reach loved ones who worked in the building and in nearby offices. On September 11th, call centers stood up to collect names, connect hospitals, and reduce rumor. Company rosters were faxed and emailed to help account for people who had evacuated. Lines formed to donate blood while officials explained that supplies would exceed need that day. Clergy from many traditions arrived to listen, pray, and offer quiet guidance without pressing. Neighbors opened homes for rest and for phone calls when networks were saturated. Traffic officers managed closures that kept emergency routes open while commuters tried to leave the city. The region learned to move together. As the fire was contained, leaders prepared to shift from pure rescue toward investigation and respectful recovery. On September 11th, that shift waited until danger fell to levels responders could manage safely. Evidence teams coordinated with command to photograph scenes, collect fragments, and map trajectories. Search dogs worked methodically while handlers watched footing in unstable rooms. Records personnel began building lists and timelines that would later support public understanding. Military units also protected sensitive areas and helped preserve accountability for documents and equipment. Each step respected the people affected and the need to know what had happened. Professional care and human care moved forward together. That balance continued through the night. By afternoon, the building had become both a workplace in crisis and a symbol under assault. On September 11th, soldiers and civilians worked side by side to keep it functioning. A large flag was hung along the damaged face as a marker of resolve. It spoke quietly to the thousands watching and to the people still working nearby. Public remarks that evening framed the day as tragedy and as a call for steadiness. Inside command, focus stayed on safety, structure, and the long task of extinguishment. Teams rotated, ate, replaced filters, and returned to work. Communication settled into a steady cadence that carried through the dark. The night would be long. Smoke rose through the night and into the next day while crews cooled hotspots and searched steadily. On September 11th, the response at the Pentagon became a long endurance test that mixed strength with restraint. Families began the painful work of waiting for news and supporting one another. Counselors set up quiet rooms and walked the grounds to meet people where they stood nearby. Command tracked fatigue and encouraged crews to rest, a discipline that protected judgment. Food services and volunteers pushed carts with water, fruit, and coffee to line. Practical kindness in small meals and shared blankets kept spirits level. Medical staff monitored breathing, burns, and eyes irritated by smoke. The work did not stop. Lessons began even as work continued, shaping changes that would ripple through emergency systems nationwide. On September 11th, commanders saw the need for common radios, clear staging, and simple language across agencies. Training later emphasized unified command, shared maps, and strong liaisons who could translate cultures. At the Pentagon, planners reviewed access routes, foam capability, collapse zones, and lighting for large scenes. Hospitals refined surge procedures and learned to protect information privacy while helping families connect. Human resources learned how to support extended leave, counseling, and long recoveries for injured workers. Military offices updated continuity plans to include flexible work sites and redundant networks. Daily drills made exit routes more familiar. Through the long hours of September 11th, the Pentagon stayed a workplace, a fireground, and a command post. People who had started their day with routine tasks ended it covered in soot and grateful to be alive. Others kept working into the night to protect the structure, help the injured, and calm families waiting for word. The building gave up heat slowly and needed constant tending. In offices farther from the strike, people returned in shifts to support logistics and to clean. Morning would find fire still smoldering, crews still rotating, and a wide circle of help still active. The Capitol took a breath and prepared for resolve that would last. On September 11th, over the quiet hills and farms of western Pennsylvania, a fourth hijacked airliner began a fight for control that would unfold in minutes. The day had already bent in New York and Washington. Yet inside this cabin, the story was still forming. Passengers buckled in with the calm of a delayed departure finally moving. The crew checked galleys and prepared for cruise. Morning light filled the windows. Radios and televisions on the ground carried breaking images that the cabin did not yet share. What began as a late takeoff would soon become a stand taken by ordinary people who refused to let terror choose the ending that day. On September 11th, the flight left Newark later than planned. A Boeing 757 turning toward the west with a full load of fuel and a cross-country plan. The delay placed the aircraft in a timeline that mattered. The crew of 4 flight attendants and 2 pilots worked through checklists with routine care. Passengers settled into seats with books, laptops, and small hopes for on-time arrivals in California. Gate agents had closed the door with normal goodbyes. Taxi and takeoff looked like any other morning in clear weather. The cabin felt ordinary and safe. That sense of normalcy shaped the opening minutes when attention still pointed toward coffee and rest. On September 11th, as the jet climbed, controllers watched it join the flow and turn west across New Jersey. Nothing on the scope hinted at the hidden plan. In the cabin, the service began and seatbelt signs clicked off. People stretched legs and checked watches. Somewhere forward, the men who intended harm waited for a moment when movement and distraction would help. The flight deck worked through routine radio calls and level-offs. The autopilot held the line. A country in shock was forming on screens far below while this airplane still felt quiet. That separation would soon end as violence broke the pattern and forced choices on everyone aboard. On September 11th, the cabin changed when attackers moved with sudden speed toward the front. Shouts rose and a struggle began near the aisle. Some passengers were pushed back and told to sit still. Others ran toward the rear galley where space allowed them to gather. The pilots lost control of the cockpit, and the aircraft turned off its planned track. A transponder code fell silent, leaving controllers with a primary return that showed speed and position without identity. Fear rippled through the cabin and settled into a tense, alert quiet. People looked to one another for direction and found it in calm voices and in simple, steady actions that worked. On September 11th, the rear galley became a small council where passengers and crew shared fragments coming from the ground. Airphones connected them to spouses, to dispatchers, and to ordinary lives that had just been pierced by terrible news. People learned that 2 planes had struck in New York, and that another had hit the Pentagon. The words September 11th gained weight while those on board tried to make sense of purpose and timing. Flight attendants spoke in level tones about injuries and needs. Callers asked about the cockpit and about the possibility of landing. Each update made the stakes clearer and tightened the spring inside the group to act. On September 11th, trained crew members described conditions to company staff and to authorities reached through operators. They reported that the plane had turned, that some people were injured, and that there might be a device meant to frighten, not to detonate. The language stayed factual and calm. It helped shape the understanding that time was short. On the ground, controllers tracked the aircraft moving southeast, then southwest, then toward Washington. Fighter jets were scrambled from bases that were ready for other kinds of threats. The distances were long and minutes were few. Up in the cabin, resolve gathered until it felt like a shared promise made in plain words together. Inside the group, a plan took shape that matched the facts coming from the ground. If the hijackers intended to use the aircraft as a weapon, the only way to protect others was to retake control. People spoke about rushing forward together, using numbers and the element of surprise. A flight attendant offered boiling water. Someone gathered the heavy cart and looked for belts to secure hands. A passenger with flying experience discussed the basics of leveling a jet if they reached the cockpit. Others called home one last time to express love and to speak clearly about the choice they were making in those minutes. It felt urgently simple. The calls home carried courage in ordinary voices. People asked spouses to care for children and to pass messages to parents. They apologized for fear caused by the news and spoke with a tenderness that steadied both sides of the line. Some prayed aloud with loved ones, sharing words from memory and from faith. Others asked about the world below and heard that the towers still burned. The purpose on board became plain. This would not end at an airport. It would end with action taken together. The decision felt heavy and clear. It moved through the group like a quiet agreement sealed by trust in those final airborne minutes. On September 11th, the forward rush began with a single push that became many feet moving at once. Shouts rose as the cart slammed against the aisle. The door ahead stayed closed, and a violent struggle began at the threshold. The aircraft pitched and rolled as those inside the cockpit tried to throw people off balance. The floor tilted and bodies slid. Yet the push resumed. Voices called out instructions and encouragement. The teamwork felt practiced even though it had formed minutes earlier. The will to save others outweighed fear. The plane dropped and climbed, but the group kept pressing with every bit of strength they had in that narrowing time. On September 11th, the soundscape inside the aircraft turned to banging, shouting, and alarms that marked altitude and speed. The jet flew low enough that fields and tree lines became visible in the windows near the back. Passengers braced and kept pushing toward the front where they believed control waited. The cockpit crew was gone, and the trained skills in the cabin ran to courage and cooperation. That was enough to matter. The aircraft pitched again. Some fell and stood back up. Others held the cart and counted to 3 for a coordinated shove. The ground rose in a blur of green and brown as the fight continued without pause there. While 9/11 played out in the cabin, controllers watched the unidentified target move back toward Washington before it turned again to the south and then east. The picture on radar lacked the details that helped decision-makers. The military launched fighters, but distance and time made interception unlikely before the end. Coordination improved by the minute across the system, yet nothing could reach this aircraft in time. The only people close enough to change the outcome were already at work inside the aisle. Their plan did not require clarity on the ground. It required courage, timing, and a commitment to hold together as long as strength allowed in that cabin. On September 11th, the struggle ended when the aircraft pitched nose down and struck a field near Shanksville, a place of farms, ridges, and a former mining site. The impact came at high speed and destroyed the plane within seconds. There was no chance for further attack on a crowded city. Investigators later assessed that the intended target was likely the Capitol or the White House. That conclusion does not change what mattered most. The people on board had decided to stop it. Their action shortened the chain of tragedy and protected others who were never aware of how close danger had come to them that morning in that wide country. Local volunteer firefighters, state police, and medics reached the scene within minutes of the calls. Smoke rose over a scarred field bordered by trees and gravel roads. The crash site was compact, with debris scattered across a manageable area. Command set perimeters and protected evidence while confirming there were no survivors to transport. Investigators from federal teams arrived and began the careful work of search and documentation. Chaplains and counselors stood nearby to help when families came to the region. The town offered food, rooms, and quiet help. The scene demanded patience and respect. It asked responders to move slowly and to treat every fragment with care for many days. News of a crash in Pennsylvania reached the nation as images from New York and Washington still filled the air. The idea of a fourth flight added a new shape to the emergency. People understood that someone on board had tried to intervene because calls described a plan to act. The grounding of the skies created a silence that kept attention fixed on the known scenes. Families in many cities listened for updates and called one another for reassurance. The scale of the day became clearer, yet so did the presence of courage in the most intimate places. On phones, in aisles, and in final words shared across the country. Today, a national memorial marks the field where the flight ended. A long walkway leads to a wall of names that faces the final path. A ring of hemlocks holds the landscape in a gentle frame. A wind sculpture called the Tower of Voices stands at the entrance and sounds with changing air. Families, school groups, and travelers come to learn and to leave quiet respect. The design invites time and reflection rather than noise. It tells a story about ordinary people who saw the day clearly and acted. Their choice shortened tragedy and protected strangers. What they did still guides our sense of duty and care in daily life. During September 11th, the sky above North America became a network that had to slow, then stop. At towers and radar rooms, controllers watched familiar streams and felt the morning change. Supervisors stepped closer and scanned for patterns. The task was to protect lives, reduce variables, and make the air manageable. It would mean holding departures, diverting en route flights, and clearing approaches quickly. The ordinary day turned into quiet, carried by thousands of steady voices. During September 11th, the command center in Virginia gathered supervisors from across the country on secure teleconferences. Screens showed traffic like constellations, each blip a plane with people, fuel, and plans. A new operations manager led with clear instructions that valued speed and safety over schedule. Hold departures from major hubs first. Transition from routine to protective posture without delay. The early calls shaped the coming hours and gave towers permission to slow the sky decisively. During September 11th, the first wide instruction was a national ground stop that froze takeoffs except for military and emergencies. Towers held flights at gates and on taxiways. Crews shut down engines and relayed updates to cabins. Passengers felt the day tilt without yet knowing why. In en route sectors, controllers began to consider where each flight could land safely within short range. Choices would stack fast. Weather, runway length, and fuel became the critical triad. The goal was to land everyone soon. During September 11th, the instruction shifted from hold to land, now at the nearest suitable field. Controllers issued vectors, altitudes, and direct clearances that shortened paths. The usual dance of requests and preferences disappeared. Approach controls opened spacing and sequenced streams with steady cadence. On tower frequencies, the pattern tightened quickly as wheels touched and reverse thrust roared. Ground controllers found remote parking and kept ramps clear. Airports became shelters where unfamiliar tales wore familiar urgency. That morning, the en route centers became bridges that connected approaches, towers, and military liaisons. Traffic managers paired with supervisors to trace every flight and choose destinations that made sense. Long hauls diverted toward large fields. Cargo crews accepted instructions and helped by reading back clearly with no delay. The map of time zones compressed into one tense hour stretched. Frequencies carried concentration. The work was technical and human, measured in miles and in steadiness. During September 11th, pilots accepted diversions to places they had never seen from cockpit level. A wide body landed at a regional field and waited for stairs tall enough. Crews asked for guidance and found help from airport staff who moved fast without fuss. Passengers disembarked onto ramps and rode buses to terminals kept under careful control. Law enforcement formed lines, checked IDs, and watched for threats. Airports turned into shelters, checkpoints, and long waiting rooms. During September 11th, Canada opened runways to dozens of flights that could not enter the United States. Controllers from coast to coast accepted diversions and built stacks for safe arrivals. In small towns, the traffic felt like history had landed. Buses rolled, kitchens were opened, and schools hosted travelers. Gander became a symbol of neighborly care, though many communities did the same work. The northern sky filled, then quieted. Across the border, coordination was practical and generous. During September 11th, flights approaching from across the Atlantic turned back toward Europe when space closed ahead. Oceanic controllers coordinated with domestic centers and relayed decisions through pilots who had already flown for hours. Crews carefully recalculated fuel and briefed cabins about long returns. Some aircraft chose Canadian fields. Others reversed track and climbed for efficient crossings. Families waiting at airports learned their travelers would not arrive. Safety drove every call, even when it meant disappointment. That morning, pilots looked out over quiet contrails that thinned and vanished as planes landed. Frequencies that usually carried chatter turned spare and focused. Weather reports and conditions filled the gaps where travel talk used to sit. In cockpits, crews ran checklists and felt an unusual stillness underneath the workload. The absence of crossing traffic simplified headings and made climbs and descents direct. The sky, once always busy, was a vault of work and silence. During September 11th, controllers managed complex flows while absorbing news from coworkers and from small televisions at the edge of rooms. Some had family in New York or Washington. Many had friends on flight decks they had worked with for years. They kept voices even and marked strips with steady pens. Supervisors watched fatigue and insisted on rotation. The craft of control is precision under pressure. On that day, precision became care for an entire country. That day, airports tightened entrances and created zones where only staff and screened passengers could move. Police and airport security increased patrols. Boarding areas emptied as flights parked and deplaned. News played on monitors beside silent gates. Airline agents answered questions with patience and admitted they did not know when flights would resume. Families met travelers at curbside and made plans to drive. Rental counters filled. The terminals felt solemn and organized, like civic shelters. That day, travelers far from home found help from cities that had not expected thousands of guests. Community centers opened with cots and coffee. Bus companies added seats on long routes that crossed states. Drivers traded hours to keep vehicles moving. Families near airports hosted strangers who needed showers and laundry. In terminals, volunteers handed out water and maps. People shared phones and directions. The mood was patient and protective. It stayed that way overnight. That day, law enforcement and airport staff began thorough sweeps of aircraft and facilities. Teams searched cabins, cargo holds, and service areas. Dogs worked along jetways and around baggage carts. Any suspicious item triggered careful procedures. The aim was to secure spaces and learn how attackers had moved. Airlines cooperated and provided rosters, schedules, and maintenance logs. The pace was relentless yet measured. Every aircraft would be checked before future departures. The message was simple. During September 11th, fighters launched to protect cities and critical sites while the civil system emptied. Coordination between defense and authorities grew tighter each hour. Air patrols formed protective rings over Washington and New York. Refueling tankers orbited to keep coverage continuous. Controllers learned new call signs and new patterns that would persist for weeks. The sight of jets reassured many and unsettled others. A new normal took shape above quiet streets and closed concourses. That day, the decision to keep the sky closed created space for checks and planning. Officials began to draft the steps that would govern any resumption. Identification rules would tighten, cockpit security would change. Ground procedures would be rethought from curb to gate. Airlines lined up maintenance and coordinated with airports for restarts. The date on the wall felt precise. Before reopening could begin, the system needed confidence and a plan for every node. That day, flight crews that had diverted far from home found themselves guests of unexpected towns. Pilots coordinated with dispatch to secure rooms and to meet duty time rules. Flight attendants looked after passengers long after deplaning, guiding people to resources and answering questions. Union representatives and managers worked side by side to cover needs. Buses were arranged for those who preferred to drive. Medication and diets were tracked. Children were kept close to guardians. That day, airline operations centers became hubs of compassion and logistics. Dispatchers monitored aircraft still airborne and supported crews on the ground. Schedulers reached out to employees, checked safety, and coordinated relief. Executives spoke to staff with frank gratitude and asked for patience. The job became service. Notes of encouragement were taped to consoles. People paused to breathe, then kept going. The work carried a promise to care for passengers and colleagues with steady attention. That day, newsrooms tried to explain what a grounded nation meant in practice. Maps showed diverted routes and clusters of aircraft at airports. Reporters interviewed controllers, pilots, and families. The language of aviation became table talk. People learned about centers, sectors, holds, and vectors. They heard how decisions climb through layers, from local to national, then back down. Explanations stayed careful and avoided speculation. The focus remained on safety, rescue, and the discipline of coordination. That day, passengers waited with a patience born of shock and community. Some sat on terminal floors and read the same paragraph for an hour. Others called home and spoke softly to children. Quiet rooms opened for prayer and reflection. Janitors and agents received thanks for simple kindness. People watched screens together and absorbed updates without argument. The shared aim was to get through the day with grace and calm. That aim held most everywhere. That day, notices to air missions and temporary restrictions expanded across regions. The alerts informed pilots and controllers where flight was forbidden and where military patrols operated. Border coordination tightened with Mexico and island airspaces. Oceanic procedures were updated to match the closure. Each message moved through systems built for routine events, and now repurposed for national protection. The architecture flexed steadily without breaking. That technical resilience helped turn a sprawling network into a protective shell. That day, the sound of the country changed to a hush that people remember years later. Highways were busy, yet the air above was strangely quiet. Television carried sirens and briefings, but neighborhoods heard birds and wind. Some people stepped outside and looked up, then paused. The date, September 11th, sat on calendars like a stone. The grounded hours taught how interwoven flight had become with daily life. Its absence made the nation feel closer. During September 11th, the decision to ground and land every flight gave cities room to focus on rescue, fire, and stability. Controllers ended shifts with tired hands and steady hearts. Pilots finished logs and called families. Passengers found beds in rooms and shelters. Airports turned down lights and kept watch through the night. The quiet held until planned reopenings began. That phase had ended. The next task would be to search, to recover, and to comfort. In the first days after 9/11, New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania moved from shock to search. Sirens softened into steady engines. Dust settled into piles and into lungs. Crews gathered at perimeters and waited for assignments. Families formed lines for news. The work began with patience and with quiet resolve. At Ground Zero, command posts rose on streets bordered by broken steel and glass. Firefighters, police, and engineers built zones and marked paths. Urban search and rescue teams arrived with dogs, cameras, and listening gear. Bucket brigades formed where machines could not reach. The tempo was careful, methodical, and relentless. Families gathered at a midtown center where counselors, nurses, and caseworkers received lists and photographs. Missing posters blossomed on walls, lampposts, and station entrances. Candles appeared beside flowers and notes. Clergy from many traditions listened and prayed. Volunteers passed water and sandwiches. The city built compassion into a working system. In Lower Manhattan, roll calls continued at firehouses while companies rotated to the pile. Hope narrowed to small sounds. Teams silenced everything and listened with devices. When taps returned nothing, they moved debris piece by piece. Welders cut beams, cranes lifted spans. Each action aimed to make space for life. Air carried dust that clung to hair and clothes and stung eyes. Masks helped but did not seal perfectly in shifts. Medics rinsed faces and checked breathing. Officials monitored samples and shared updates. People did the work in front of them while noting coughs and sore throats that lingered afterward. In Arlington, Work at the Pentagon continued through days of extinguishment and structured search. Crews rotated through heat and darkness while engineers measured stability. Families met with officials in halls. Chaplains walked the lawns. Flags appeared on fences. The building remained a workplace even as recovery and respect guided step. In Pennsylvania, a compact crash site drew investigators, troopers, and volunteers from nearby towns. Command set perimeters and marked grids. Search dogs worked carefully across the field. Residents offered rooms and meals. Families arrived to a quiet place of hemlock and wind. The early work mixed precision with deep care. Logistics defined much of the first week. Heavy equipment moved under strict control. Operators waited for hand signals from spotters who guarded voids where survivors might have been. When machines stopped, bucket lines advanced stones and ash in loads. The scale felt endless, yet the method preserved safety and possibility. Responder well-being became a command task. Shift lengths shortened. Staging tents offered food, rest, and replacement gear. Counselors circulated and reminded crews to drink water and to call home. Notes from school children appeared on tables. Local restaurants sent meals at hours. The city built endurance with kindness and structure. At the medical examiner's office, work turned to identification and care for remains. Scientists cataloged items, recorded locations, and applied emerging DNA methods. Families provided brushes and letters to help establish profiles. Clerks guarded accuracy with quiet focus. The goal was names returned with honor. The timeline would be long. Public life recalibrated around mourning and steadiness. Vigils filled church steps, synagogues, mosques, and greens. A national service gathered leaders and families to pray and listen. Candles shone in windows. Television screens carried moments of silence. The words, September 11th, were spoken with care as people tried to honor loss. Security presence increased where needed. National Guard units took posts at airports, bridges, and tunnels. Police managed checkpoints prioritizing emergency traffic. Ferries carried workers and supplies along rivers while subways reopened in stages. The city learned routes around closed zones. People adapted calmly, one block and one day at a time. Phone banks and websites connected volunteers to needs. Blood centers coordinated supplies to match hospital capacity. The Red Cross managed shelters and counseling. FEMA integrated federal help with city plans. Donations arrived in waves. Logistics teams sorted gloves, boots, and lights. The response moved on lists, radios, and small acts. Family assistance centers offered casework, flights for relatives, and help with needs. Tables held tissues, water, and forms. Counselors guided people through missing person reports and identification steps. Interpreters helped bridge language gaps. Children were given places to draw. Volunteers watched toddlers while parents met with staff. Dignity shaped interaction. Faith groups, unions, and civic clubs found roles that matched their strengths. Choirs sang at shelters. Bagpipes sounded at station doors. Librarians hosted reading rooms near assistance centers. Teachers organized drives. Neighbors cooked for responders. The rituals began to change, honoring service and giving people a way to stand together. Newsrooms adjusted tone toward careful verification. Reporters worked from designated zones and deferred to officials on sensitive details. Networks added crawl lines with numbers for assistance. Local stations highlighted community resources and ways to help. Editors rejected speculation and focused on known facts. The aim was light, steadiness, and respect. In the days after 9/11, storefronts and porches carried flags. Drivers tapped horns for passing convoys. Stadiums paused for silence before games resumed weeks later. Neighbors checked on elders and on new families down the hall. A common gentleness spread in small acts. People helped because helping felt like breathing. Coordination matured by the day. Federal teams integrated with city command through roles and shared maps. Liaisons linked agencies that had rarely worked together at such scale. Briefings tracked progress and hazards. Forms simplified requests. Training schedules grew on paper even as work continued on the ground. The system learned. Transportation returned in stages. Bridges reopened with inspections. Trains and ferries added service to carry workers toward edge of the closed zone. Cyclists rode in groups with masks. Trucks queued for clearance. The region's rhythm restarted with care. People measured days by which routes were open and which remained guarded. In the first week after September 11th, funerals began even as many names were still listed as missing. Bagpipes led processions that stopped traffic along blocks. Honor guards folded flags and stepped aside for families. Eulogy spoke of humor, skill, and kindness. A city grieved and kept showing up to work. Information work never stopped. Hotlines connected families to caseworkers who could check lists and answer hard questions gently. Websites updated hours and routes. Press briefings offered times rather than speculation. Rumor control mattered. Accuracy kept worry from spreading and saved time. The city used clarity as a form of care. In the neighborhoods beyond the core after 9/11, block associations checked stairwells and courtyards. Stores reopened with shortened hours. Teachers welcomed students back with patience and routines. Coaches canceled games and held practices. Shared spaces stayed calm. The aim was to give children and elders ground while the city healed. Supplies arrived from unions, companies, and towns. Hard hats, respirators, gloves, and boots stacked into caches. Carpenters built ramps and tables. Electricians rigged lights along paths. Plumbers ran lines for washing stations. Construction hands worked beside firefighters and police. Respect ran ways. Everyone understood skills required and deferred with grace. Search dogs worked long hours with handlers who watched pause and energy. Veterinarians established stations to clean eyes and treat cuts. Volunteers offered water bowls and spaces. Applause greeted teams as they entered and left the site. The partnership between people and animals carried hope even when silence followed searches. Abroad after 9/11, embassies received flowers and notes. Cities held gatherings in solidarity. Firehouses in countries sent banners that hung on Manhattan walls. Calls came from allied teams offering expertise. The gestures mattered to people on shift who stepped outside for air and saw evidence of care waiting beside fences. Environmental teams sampled air and dust. Agencies issued guidance that evolved with findings. Crews were urged to wear respirators whenever work allowed. Decontamination stations expanded. Street washing increased. Residents near the site received information about cleaning and support services. The science moved step by step while compassion remained the standard. Among those working after 9/11 were teams searching for colleagues from their own houses. Helmets rested on truck bumpers during roll calls. Chalk marks recorded entries and times. Some found locker keys and photos in pockets. These recoveries mattered. They offered proof of presence and gave families objects to hold. Morale traveled through simple gifts. Stations swapped patches and pinned them to boards. Restaurants sent trays in afternoon and late at night. Letters from children were taped to helmets and to lockers. Musicians came with guitars and played quietly near tents. The scene held sorrow and a thread of comfort. As the week moved after 9/11, briefings set daily rhythms. The mayor and commissioners gave updates and took questions. Doctors explained injury patterns and needs. Utilities reported progress on power and water near the site. The stock exchange prepared to reopen. The message balanced resolve with caution and steady gratitude. Schools reopened with counselors in hallways and extra adults in classrooms. Teachers kept lessons gentle and simple. Attendance sheets mattered less than tone. Principals visited rooms and spoke quietly with students who had worries. Parents gathered at pickup lines and compared notes. The structure of school helped families reclaim hours. Across companies after 9/11, employee assistance lines expanded. Human resources arranged counseling and leave. Payroll teams ensured benefits reached affected families. Offices near the site relocated to backup spaces and shared desks. Technology staff built networks quickly. The private sector became an arm of care as well as Commerce Week. Clinics documented exposures and began registries to follow long-term health. Baseline tests were offered to responders. Physicians explained symptoms worth monitoring. Mental health teams taught breathing and grounding to interrupt flashbacks and panic. People learned to ask for help early. These steps built a path for care and study. By the end of the first week, search shifted slowly toward recovery and to the long work of remembrance. The piles lowered. The rivers kept moving. Families held photographs at services and began new rituals. The city exhaled and steadied. Questions gathered for later, but care remained the central duty. After 9/11, the search for explanation moved from smoke and rubble to paper, interviews and timelines that could hold together. Officials asked who planned the attacks, how the teams formed, how they entered the country, and how they turned training into murder. The answers were assembled slowly from flight records, visas, bank trails, captured notes, and testimony from those who had known the men. They showed a plot shaped by a small leadership circle, patient movement across borders, practice flights, and disciplined use of ordinary systems. Debate then widened to responsibility, gaps in defense, and how to reduce future risk without losing the freedoms people valued. Investigators traced 9/11 to a leader who had publicly declared war on the United States through fatwas and taped statements, and to a planner known for technical skill. Financing moved through donors, couriers, and front charities, then into travel, rent, and lessons that looked routine to clerks behind counters. Training occurred in camps abroad where recruits learned discipline, security habits, and confidence on small aircraft before they sought time in larger simulators. The goal was to use the strengths of open travel. and to exploit assumptions inside cockpits and towers that still expected negotiation. The core operators were selected for loyalty, patience, and willingness to live quietly in new neighborhoods while they prepared. Several entered the United States with visas obtained through standard processes and answered questions that matched harmless travel plans. They opened bank accounts with small deposits, rented mailboxes, signed leases, and enrolled in flight schools from Florida to Arizona. They learned enough procedures to feel comfortable, yet not enough to earn licenses for the largest aircraft. Two who had trained abroad became pilot leaders and brought a third to that role after further practice. Muscle hijackers arrived later in small groups, sometimes meeting handlers who helped with housing, IDs, and transportation. Money moved through transfers small enough to avoid alarm, topped off with cash carried by couriers who traveled clean. During the summer, the pilots and teams reconnoitered airports, practiced on simulators, and reviewed schedules that would put 4 planes into the air within minutes of each other. They selected cross-country routes that carried heavy fuel and offered long windows once airborne. They studied seating maps and the timing of service to spot chances for coordinated movement. They rehearsed behavior that looked like tourists and students, which masked intention until the last minutes. Explaining the plot after the fact required care to honor those lost and to avoid turning a how-to guide into public record. Reports therefore focused on intent, preparation, and broad methods, rather than on steps that would help copycats. They outlined the hierarchy, the travel paths, and the way ordinary tools were abused. They showed how the hijackers relied on surprise, on confusion, and on training manuals that assumed negotiation. A national commission was formed to tell the story with independence, to assign responsibility where evidence supported it, and to recommend changes. It collected millions of pages, interviewed hundreds of officials and witnesses, and staged public hearings that gave citizens a window into process. The final report described the plot, mapped the failures, and offered a plan to knit together intelligence, aviation security, border controls, and emergency response. It became a shared reference text in homes, classrooms, and city halls where policy meets lived experience. Debate about intelligence after 9/11 focused on fragments often held in places, how legal walls slowed sharing, and how culture discouraged risk-taking across agencies. Analysts saw pieces of a picture that did not move quickly to those with arrest power, while field agents felt urgency that headquarters did not match. Leaders later urged new joint centers, common databases, and daily habits that would put teams together before crisis began. Critics argued that warnings were plain, while defenders pointed to rules and to hindsight that makes any timeline look simple. Aviation security drew scrutiny for reliance on contractors, for low pay and turnover, and for rules that allowed small blades on board. Checkpoint training had aimed at interdiction of obvious weapons and at customer service, not at systematic screening that assumed determination and rehearsal by attackers. The answer became federalization, standardization, hardened cockpit doors, random screening by air marshals, and crew training that emphasized decisive action. Passengers also learned that compliance with hijackers no longer protected others, and that collective resistance could change outcomes. Travel systems faced questions about visas, identity documents, and the speed of placing known threats on watch lists that reach every counter. Changes added biometric checks, tighter interviews, and more data shared with carriers before boarding. Critics warned about civil liberties and the risk of error, while supporters argued that travel is a privilege that carries mutual duties. The tension between freedom and screening entered daily life at consulates, at airports, and at land crossings, where patience became part of the cost of safety. Responsibility for air defense raised its own debates when timelines showed confusion about hijack status, missing transponder codes, and scrambled jets searching large skies. Protocols had been built for threats from outside national airspace, not for domestic liners flown as weapons. Reforms brought closer liaisons, faster notifications, shared screens, and regional centers that could talk in plain language without delay. Training emphasized improbable scenarios so that improvisation would not begin from zero during a crisis. Money trails prompted difficult questions about donors, charities, and officials in allied countries whose citizens were drawn into violent networks. Investigations found support that was ideological and private, and also gaps in enforcement that allowed funds to move through banks and exchange houses. Governments were pressed to criminalize financing, to audit charities, and to cooperate against facilitators, while preserving ties that served other interests. Some argued that broader policy toward the region shaped risk more than any bank closure, while others insisted that focused financial pressure could starve plots. At home, new powers for surveillance, detention, and information sharing brought another set of debates that touched courts, libraries, and living rooms. Supporters saw urgent need and temporary measures, while critics feared drift toward permanent expansion that could burden harmless communities. Many agreed that safety and rights were not enemies, yet that compromise required oversight, transparency, and a habit of asking hard questions even in grief. Public trust rose when officials explained rules, published audits, and corrected mistakes in plain view. Abroad, the response turned first to the group that had hosted and trained the attackers, and to the rulers who had granted sanctuary. Allies built coalitions for pressure, sanctions, and strikes, then for reconstruction, and for efforts to reduce the space that violent networks could use. These choices brought their own debates about strategy, timelines, and unintended effects, which would grow in intensity as campaigns expanded. Families of the murdered asked for justice that was both firm and careful, and insisted that policy serve the memory of those taken. Noise gathered around fringe explanations that denied basic facts, misused physics, or accused large numbers of public servants of impossible secrecy. Scientists, engineers, and investigators responded with measurements, peer review, and transparent timelines that showed how damage and fire led to failure. The best answer to false stories remained respectful truth told clearly and patiently, anchored in sources that anyone could inspect. Over time, the story of planning became part of civic education, with museums, memorials, and classrooms explaining how small groups can harm open societies. Teachers emphasized critical thinking, empathy for victims, and respect for responders, while also exploring the line between safety and liberty. Students learned how investigators build timelines from ordinary records and how small clues, when shared, prevent larger harm. That approach created public awareness that does not trade in fear, and that helps citizens judge policies with steady minds. Media learned to cover such plots with fewer dramatics, more diagrams, and steady language that respects loss while teaching facts. Editors favored maps that show travel paths, timelines that mark decisions, and careful interviews with investigators who speak in responsible detail. They also highlighted the work of families who built foundations, scholarship funds, and healthcare programs that honor the dead through service. Coverage improved when newsrooms included experts in aviation, emergency management, and civil liberties, so that context kept speculation in check. Not every question found a perfect answer, because memory fades, sources conflict, and some records were lost in fire. Families asked why travel alerts failed to stop entries, why pilots did not receive different guidance earlier, and why warnings did not trigger broader moves. Officials explained what they knew, what they did, and where they fell short. And some offered apologies that mattered even when late. Accountability included resignations, reforms, and the humility to accept that complex systems can fail without malice, yet must be improved without delay. For many Americans, the explanations around 9/11 offered both relief and sorrow, because understanding the plot did not lighten grief, but it did restore a sense of order. It showed that small groups can do vast harm when they use our openness against us, and that resilience answers with unity, skill, and measured resolve. Clear timelines, shared data, and practiced cooperation became the quiet architecture built after the fires went out. That architecture continues to guide travel, emergency work, and local government, and gives citizens practical tools to spot risk early. As the explanations settled into public life, September 11th remained more than a case study, because it lived in families, in firehouses, and in long care. The debates became part of how the country practices safety with respect, and how it argues about power without losing kindness. From those arguments came new rules for travel and new habits in workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods, which we will meet as the story moves forward. In that patient spirit, the chapter of explanation closes, and the next long task begins with the rules that entered daily routine. After September 11th, home changed in visible and quiet ways that reached airports, offices, schools, and corners of daily errands. The government built new layers of security that met people at doors. A new department gathered many agencies under one roof to reduce gaps. A new agency took charge of aviation screening at every checkpoint. Citizens learned new habits that felt strange at first and then became routine. Travel slowed, then found a steadier rhythm built around lines, bins, and identification checks. Buildings added guards and stronger glass. Stadiums tightened entry. Subways trained riders to speak up. Libraries, classrooms, and small businesses adjusted record-keeping and procedures. News anchors began to read advisories during storms and during alerts. The tone of daily life shifted from openness alone to openness plus awareness. The aim was simple: protect people without losing the character of ordinary days. That balance took effort and patience everywhere. Air travel after 9/11 became the visible classroom for the new rules. Federal screeners in blue shirts replaced contractors and worked from national standards. Lines organized around trays, belts, and signs that asked people to empty pockets and remove laptops. Shoes came off after an attempted bombing that used a shoe as hiding place. Liquids faced limits after a plot abroad aimed to mix components in flight. The 311 rule entered conversation. Bottles and gels went into small bags. Identification was checked at entry and sometimes again at the gate. Random checks added unpredictability. Advanced imaging machines appeared and sparked debates about privacy and health. Crews trained for reinforced doors and for rapid coordination with law enforcement. Air marshals rode routes in greater numbers. Most flights felt ordinary, yet the preparation behind each one grew. Airports became places where patience and clarity protected strangers who had never met. Beyond airports, the new department stood up joint operations that blended border work, disaster response, and threat assessment. Color-coded alerts appeared on television tickers and on signs in stations. The system later changed to planar bulletins, but early years taught people to expect tones about risk. Fusion centers gathered analysts from local, state, and federal offices to share data and watch patterns together. Port inspectors scanned containers with new tools and selected some for deep checks. Critical infrastructure owners added barriers, cameras, and better lighting. The phrase, "see something, say something," spread through posters and announcements. It encouraged attention without panic. Police expanded training for active threats. Transit officers learned to respond swiftly while keeping service moving. Clerks and janitors were coached to notice unattended bags and odd behavior. The goal was early notice that allows calm action. Security became a shared practice built from thousands of small eyes. Borders and identity moved into daily talk after 9/11 as licenses, passports, and databases became tools for trust. The Real ID law set standards for state documents so that security officers could rely on consistent checks. Passports adopted new chips that help verify authenticity. Fingerprints and photos were collected more often at entries. Airlines sent passenger information before departure so watch lists could be checked in time. The no-fly list and the selectee list became part of travel language. People sometimes felt the friction of mistaken matches and appealed through new processes. Oversight boards reviewed rules and recommended corrections. Most travelers felt little change beyond time and routine questions. Those with complex histories faced more interviews. Border officers balanced welcome and caution. The aim was to know who was moving and to intercept those who should not. The tools were imperfect but improved with review, training, and better data links. Communities closest to suspicion after 9/11 carried extra burdens that required attention and fairness. Muslim, Arab, and South Asian families saw bias in workplaces and on streets. Sikhs wearing turbans faced attacks from people who did not understand who they were. Civil rights groups organized hotlines and legal clinics. Police departments built liaison units to open steady lines with mosques and community centers. Schools trained staff to interrupt bullying and to teach respect. Federal offices met with advocates to adjust policies that were causing harm without improving safety. Many citizens learned to separate individuals from the crimes of a few. Trust grew when leaders spoke clearly against prejudice, and when officers disciplined those who failed standards. Over time, new stories entered local news that showed neighbors working together. The promise of equal protection remained a guide and a test. Safety worked best where dignity and voice were protected every day. Another shock after 9/11 came through the mail when anthrax spores were sent to media and political offices. The response taught new lessons about screening, ventilation, and protective gear. Mailrooms added gloves, masks, and isolation bins. Buildings reviewed air handling and installed filters with higher ratings. Public health labs expanded capacity and standardized tests. Clinics sharpened triage questions to notice odd clusters of symptoms. Schools and offices practiced shelter in place along with evacuation drills. Cities adopted a common incident system so agencies could work together without confusion. Training brought firefighters, police, medics, and public health into the same classrooms. Citizens joined community emergency teams and learned basics of first aid, search, and radio use. The idea of readiness moved from specialists to neighborhoods. People kept go bags and checked batteries. Workplaces named floor wardens and mapped exits. Preparedness found a place in daily calendars rather than in distant binders. City streets changed in small, sturdy ways after 9/11. Government buildings and landmarks installed bollards, planters, and better standoff. Bridges and tunnels gained cameras tied to control rooms. Office towers adopted universal badge systems with photo verification and timed access. Visitors signed in and wore printed passes. Freight elevators saw tighter rules. Loading docks scheduled deliveries with more oversight. Stadiums and arenas created clear bag policies and magnetometer lines. Museums checked backpacks and limited sizes. Transit hubs added patrols with dogs and trained eyes. The spread of cameras raised questions about data storage, misuse, and oversight. Cities wrote policies, set retention limits, and created audit logs. Some posted signs describing goals and contacts for concerns. Civil liberties groups pressed for public debate when systems expanded. The shared aim was security with accountability and clear rules. People learned that design could guide behavior without turning every corner into a gate everywhere. Schools and universities adjusted many routines after 9/11. Campuses installed card readers at more doors and staffed entry desks at residence halls. Emergency alert systems grew from email lists into text, speakers, and signs that light when danger is near. Drills added lockdown to the familiar fire evacuations. Study abroad offices strengthened risk reviews and communication plans. International students navigated new visa checks and closer tracking of enrollment. Libraries reviewed privacy policies and explained what they could protect. Research labs updated access and inventory rules. Teachers learned how to speak about September 11th with care, noting facts without inflaming hurt. Counselors trained for trauma and for the long tail of grief. Parents filled forms that described medications and contacts. Schools invited first responders to meet students and to build trust. Bus drivers practiced reroutes. The rhythm of learning continued with a layer of awareness that became part of campus life. Workplaces found a new cadence after September 11th that combined welcome with verification. Tenants used badges for elevators and suites. Reception desks checked visitors against prearranged lists and asked for identification. Meeting planners collected names early. Mailrooms logged packages and trained for suspicious signs. Companies reviewed data security and watched for social engineering. Cyber defenses grew because malicious actors used the same openness that physical attackers had used. Drills expanded beyond fire to include shelter, evacuation by stairs, and accounting for people with disabilities. Travel policies required contact information, backup plans, and emergency briefings for high-risk areas. Some firms created small reserves of supplies to keep offices running during disruptions. Others wrote continuity plans that included remote work options and alternate sites. Facilities tested generators and communications. Human resources prepared support lines, leave options, and counseling. The goal was care for people and a steady path back to normal work. Culture adapted to the new routines after 9/11 and found ways to keep days humane. Anniversaries brought moments of silence in schools, stadiums, and offices. Broadway and baseball returned with tighter security and warm welcomes. Bags were checked at arenas and fans arrived earlier to pass calmly through lines. Airline humor softened into instructions designed to build confidence. Pre-check later offered an option that traded background checks for speed. At stations and on trains, announcements reminded riders to report unattended items. Families learned the rhythm of packing, screening, and boarding. Children grew up seeing travel as a practiced sequence instead of a mystery. Memorials opened and invited quiet visits. News programs interviewed survivors and responders with care. The phrase 9/11 became a marker people used to place time. It named loss and patience. The habits born in that era settled into muscle memory without pushing out kindness or welcome anywhere. Oversight shaped the maturing system that grew after 9/11. Inspectors General audited programs and reported on waste, results, and ethics. Courts reviewed new authorities and corrected overreach. Congress held hearings that improved training and funded fixes. Local councils asked whether cameras, sensors, or patrols matched the risks they faced. Adjustments followed. Some measures eased when better tools arrived. Other rules became permanent because they worked. People noticed both costs and benefits. Travel took longer and demanded planning. Security jobs created careers with pride and stress. Mistakes still happened and prompted apologies. Families felt safe and sometimes impatient. Over time, the system learned to value courtesy, clear language, and help for travelers who need extra time. The aim stayed steady: protect without hardening hearts. The home front settled into routines while the country looked outward. Decisions abroad gathered force in parallel, and their consequences would return home in many ways. After September 11th, the United States looked outward and prepared for war in places that had harbored the planners. Intelligence pointed to camps and a regime that had offered safe ground. Allies gathered and sketched goals that matched public grief and duty. The first aim was to disrupt and destroy the network that had sent men to the plains. The second was to deny sanctuary. The third was to support a local alternative that could hold ground once the camps were broken. Military planners shaped a light initial footprint that relied on special operations, air power, and local partners. Diplomats lined up basing rights while aid teams assembled supplies. Congress debated, then voted with broad support. Families listened for clarity and asked that justice be firm and careful. The season turned and planes lifted into the night. The country carried hope and worry together. The long road had begun. For many. In Afghanistan, the opening weeks unfolded with speed that surprised many observers. Special operations teams linked with local fighters who knew the valleys and approached strongholds with patience. Air crews dropped precision munitions guided by spotters on ridge lines. The ruling movement fractured under pressure and fled key cities. Northern leaders entered Kabul as ministries reopened with doors propped and phones borrowed. Journalists filmed women returning to classrooms and men shaving beards to mark change. Refugees came back over border paths and tried to find relatives. Command pursued senior figures toward mountains near the east. Caves became targets and names echoed in briefings. At Tora Bora, local deals and thin presence left gaps that later became painful to recount. Some leaders escaped across unseen routes, and the fight shifted from removal to pursuit. The ease of the first weeks carried hidden risk. Holding would be harder. Building institutions would take years. After September 11th, attention turned from rooting enemies to shaping a state that could stand. Allies met in foreign capitals and backed an interim leader who promised inclusion. An international force guarded the capital while aid groups rebuilt clinics, courts, and schools. Provincial areas remained complex with militias, rivalries, and weak roads. Weather and terrain limited reach and fed local power brokers who balanced cooperation with profit. Opium returned as a cash crop that funded factions and distorted government work. Police training moved slower than planned, and courts lacked staff and records. Corruption spread through contracts and checkpoints and left families angry at checkpoints. Insurgents regrouped in rural districts and across borders that were hard to seal. Bombs returned to roads and markets and signaled a long war ahead. Families weighed hope against fear each season and watched sons guard checkpoints far from home. Progress existed yet felt fragile. Trust lagged. Debate after 9/11 soon widened to Iraq, a country with a hostile ruler and a long record of defiance. Some officials argued that leaving him in place risked future disasters. They cited weapons programs, old violations, and the possibility of links that most analysts did not confirm. Others warned that a second war would divide allies and distract from unfinished work in Afghanistan. Congress held hearings and voted to authorize force while seeking diplomacy at the United Nations. Inspectors returned and asked for more time to check sites and interview scientists. Public opinion split along questions of threat, patience, and the lessons of earlier fights. The administration built a case and assembled a coalition that was smaller than hoped. Diplomacy narrowed and deadlines were set. The capital braced for another campaign. Families read news with worry and asked whether the effort would weaken the first war. Soon, the choice was made. In Iraq, the opening weeks moved fast as armored columns crossed deserts and split the defense. Airstrikes suppressed command and cut lines that fed units in the field. Coalition troops reached the capital and found statues falling while ministries burned nearby. Television showed crowds cheering and looting, a mix that confused viewers about the mood. The government collapsed faster than planners expected and left a vacuum of authority. Units guarded oil sites, museums, and palaces with limited numbers and long lists. Basic services failed, and neighborhoods organized ad hoc security that varied street by street. Weapons stockpiles were looted and fed later violence. News briefings spoke of a turning point that would soon stabilize the country. Behind the cameras, the tasks multiplied and grew harder. The first victory created a second fight. Keeping order would require choices that touched politics, pride, and livelihoods. Those choices came soon. Consequences followed. Post-war orders disbanded the army and dismissed many civil servants tied to the old party. Some welcomed the break as moral clarity. Others warned that families had lost income and status overnight. Anger and fear fed an insurgency that drew on former soldiers, criminals, and foreign fighters. Explosions hit stations, markets, mosques, and patrols, and the map filled with grief. Kidnapping and intimidation silenced professionals and drove families to safer districts. Sectarian killings sharpened divides that politics should have softened. Local leaders tried to assemble councils and hire police while training lagged behind violence. American units adapted by learning neighborhoods, partnering with elders, and building small bases. Losses mounted and patience at home thinned as months turned into hard years. Veterans returned with injuries seen and unseen and began long recoveries. The promise of quick transformation drifted out of reach. The cost of mistakes grew clearer. Trust again lagged. Worry. Years after 9/11, a change in approach brought more troops and a new focus on protecting people. Commanders moved units off large bases and into joint stations with local forces. They partnered with neighborhoods to map threats and to mediate disputes. In the West, tribes turned against foreign extremists who had abused custom and rule. Payments, respect, and local pride built alliances called awakenings. Checkpoints multiplied, and bomb makers were captured or killed in raids conducted at night. Markets reopened behind concrete walls, and families ventured back to work. Casualties fell, though fear remained. Politics tried to catch up with the breathing space created by the surge. Laws on oil, elections, and amnesty stalled or inched forward. Refugees returned unevenly and found homes damaged or taken. The improvement was real and incomplete. Families breathed easier at dusk. Leaders argued about when to leave. Promises clashed with conditions. Time mattered. Patience. Back in Afghanistan, the war stretched as rural districts flipped between control and threat. NATO partners expanded roles and sent battalions to provinces that had been quiet. Road projects, schools, and clinics showed progress while insurgents targeted them to sap faith. Sanctuaries across borders complicated efforts and allowed leaders to rest, recruit, and plan. A campaign of strikes pressured networks but sometimes harmed civilians and fed anger. Governance problems persisted when corruption stole salaries, fuel, and trust. Women gained seats in councils yet faced threats that made travel dangerous. Teachers taught through fear and asked for locks, lights, and books that arrived late. Farmers weighed poppy, wheat, and risk each spring. Villagers judged outsiders by fairness at checkpoints and by words kept. Commands rotated and tried to pass lessons across units and years. The mission narrowed to training and advising even as violence persisted. timetables entered speeches and plans publicly. Far from battlefields, the legal frame of war after 9/11 raised hard questions. Detentions tested boundaries of law, rights, and intelligence gathering. A prison offshore became a symbol that divided opinion at home and abroad. Some officials defended policies as necessary in a shadowed fight. Others warned that torture and secrecy harmed values and produced bad information. Courts, inspectors, and voters forced changes that narrowed abuses and clarified rules. Allies balanced cooperation with criticism and watched elections for shifts. Intelligence sharing deepened in some circles and cooled in others. Diplomats spent long hours repairing trust that wore strains. Families followed hearings and wondered whether mistakes would be owned fully. Veterans returned to clinics that grew to meet physical and moral wounds. Benefit systems expanded and struggled under paperwork and need. Neighbors learned to ask how service had changed lives and to listen. Cities organized help desks for military families locally. As years passed, the country sought exits that honored sacrifice and protected gains. Iraq saw a drawdown that transferred bases to national forces and left advisors. Politics remained tense and shaped security in ways that soldiers could not fix alone. A new extremist group broke across borders and took cities with shocking speed. Local fighters regrouped with outside help while air power battered convoys and positions. Civilians fled and formed camps that stayed for seasons and then years. Cities were retaken block by block with heavy cost to homes and history. Trials followed and politics shifted again under new pressures. In Afghanistan, the mission narrowed to training and to supporting local command. Some districts improved, while others slipped back when units rotated and roads failed. Negotiations rose and fell as leaders tested talks and deadlines. Citizens watched and measured promises against daily safety in markets and schools. Fatigue influenced debate. The long campaigns born after 9/11 carried costs counted in lives, treasure, and attention. Allies stood with the United States and also questioned choices when hopes dimmed. Adversaries studied tactics and probed for gaps. Humanitarian groups cared for civilians and pressed all sides to reduce harm. Journalists recorded bravery, error, and grief, and gave people at home a window into far places. Students grew up watching maps of regions they had not expected to study. Elections turned on strategy, on lies told, and on truths learned the hard way. Respect for service stayed strong, while arguments about policy stayed sharp. Through it all, the memory of 9/11 remained the anchor that explained why the country had moved. That memory asked for justice with restraint, and for safety with humility. It asked leaders to tell hard truths about limits, and to keep promises to those who served. Its echoes still continue. In the long years after 9/11, the country learned to carry names, to tend health, and to build memory into public life. Grief stayed present, but changed shape as days turned into seasons and then into decades. Families traced rituals that gave structure to love, while cities shaped spaces that could hold silence. Responders kept appointments, told doctors about coughs and sleep, and tried to return to work. Teachers explained context to students who had not been born. Travelers passed fountains and flags with quieter steps. The long aftermath asked for patience. It also asked for accuracy, care, and attention. Names became anchors that kept loss from floating away. Reading them aloud each year gave the public a duty and gave families a space to breathe. Bells marked time. Photos were held up and carried through rain and bright sun. The list included parents, partners, siblings, friends, and colleagues whose workdays ended in smoke and dust. Children who had learned to speak after the day now stood as adults and said the names with clear voices. The promise behind the ritual was simple. No one would be reduced to numbers. In the language of 9/11, memory means saying every name. Memorials shaped how cities hold the story. In New York, 2 pools trace the outlines of towers that once made shadows at noon. Water falls into square voids where bronze panels carry the names. In Arlington, curved benches tilt toward the sky or toward the building to mark ages and flight paths. On a field in Pennsylvania, a wall faces the final path, and a tower sounds with wind. Guides speak softly, and families visit in every season. The date September 11th appears on plaques and programs. It signals care and clarity. Visitors leave in lines, speaking less and thoughtfully. Health became a long thread that joined firehouses, clinics, and homes. Many responders and residents developed coughs, asthma, and later cancers linked to exposure. Others carried headaches, ringing, and trouble sleeping that arrived months after the smoke cleared. The health programs created to respond offered monitoring, treatment, and registries that track patterns over time. Paperwork felt heavy, yet staff learned to guide families through it. Laws funded care and renewed that promise after long campaigns by advocates. Counselors taught simple tools that help with memory and stress. People learned that healing after 9/11 is both medical and social, and patient. Grief followed its own courses that did not match timetables. Some people felt strong for months and then were surprised by waves. Others struggled early and found footing with time and help. Children grew with memories of a parent shaped by photos and stories. Schools invited counselors, created rooms, and taught teachers how to notice changes. Faith leaders learned to speak with care and to leave space for silence. Peer groups for spouses, parents, and siblings created circles where no one had to explain background. The language of help became practical. It welcomed those whose hardest day had been September 11th. Names moved into daily spaces where people work and learn. Streets were renamed near schools and firehouses. Scholarship funds helped students finish degrees begun by a parent who never came home. Foundations supported health programs, training, and neighbor projects that reflect the values of those remembered. Portraits hung in lobbies and were paired with plaques that told stories in spare lines. Companies held days and sent volunteers to plant trees or stock pantries. Coaches stitched patches onto uniforms for a season. Choirs sang at memorial runs each fall. Gestures turned memory into action and placed love into motion for many. Artists and writers helped people make sense without forcing meaning too early. Painters worked in gray and in bright color. Photographers focused on hands holding photographs and on the light that returned to streets. Playwrights staged small rooms where ordinary choices mattered. Poets wrote about dust and uniforms and about quiet dinners when someone was missing. Museums built exhibits that explained timelines with artifacts, maps, and calm narration. Curators avoided spectacle and trusted visitors to linger. Films traced responders, families, and journeys back to work. The story of 9/11 became part of culture without drowning it. Art kept empathy awake. Anniversaries created a calendar that balanced work and remembrance. Morning traffic paused for moments of silence in offices and on sidewalks. At stadiums, umbrellas of color lowered as crowds stood together in a quiet wider than any call. In classrooms, teachers described the day with careful detail and avoided repeating rumor. Students compared notes with grandparents who remembered other turning points. Families visited memorials in spring and summer when travel was easier. Some people came on weekdays to avoid crowds. Others sought the shared strength of the reading. The ritual grew simple. Speak the names, hold the silence. Keep going. Public debate did not end with the first reforms. Citizens kept asking how to protect rights while guarding crowded places. Libraries defended reader privacy and published clear policies about requests for records. Courts reviewed programs and required limits, audits, and notice. Legislatures adjusted tools that had grown faster than oversight. Police trained on bias, de-escalation, and transparent communication during tense calls. Community boards asked for impact reports before cameras were installed. Reporters measured results without chasing drama. The goal remained steady. Safety should not hollow out freedom. The memory of 9/11 added weight, but did not end argument entirely. Economic recovery took years and moved in uneven lines. Downtown businesses rebuilt customer bases while construction sites changed streets daily. Some companies returned to old blocks. Others moved north or across the river. Workers rode trains to new desks and kept taking calls from clients who missed landmarks. Insurance disputes dragged in court and then settled. Building codes incorporated lessons about stairs, radios, and fireproofing. Engineers modeled loads and planned longer exit times. The Trade Center grew beside memorial plazas and transit halls that glowed at night. Tourists returned with cameras. Cafes reopened. The skyline held grief and renewal together. Compensation and care sat beside each other like hands. Families received support through funds created to address immediate needs and future stability. Responders and survivors turned to clinics that specialized in exposure and trauma. The system was complicated, with forms, deadlines, and proofs that were hard to gather while working in parenting. Advocates organized legal aid and explained options during evenings in union halls and centers. Case managers kept lists and called back. Doctors wrote letters and linked symptoms to exposures when evidence supported it. The promise behind the maze was simple. After 9/11, people would not face illness alone. Faith communities learned to walk together without blurring difference. Clergy exchanged pulpits and stood side by side during vigils. Volunteers welcomed neighbors to kitchens set up after services. Chaplains trained for deployments at hospitals and disaster scenes. Choirs learned music from other traditions and found common ground in breath and listening. Youth groups built ramps, painted rooms, and delivered groceries to elders. Counselors met quietly with people who feared stigma for grief that had not eased. The work was practical and grounded. It made room for sorrow and for laughs. It taught that strength and tenderness are companions, not rivals. Emergency services rewrote manuals that had not kept up with scale. Agencies practiced unified command so that titles mattered less than the task in front of them. Radios were updated and repeaters were added in dense buildings. Dispatch protocols were clarified so that alarms move without delay across lines. Stockpiles of masks, gloves, and lights were built in places easy to reach. Training films used voices and avoided drama. Crews drilled stairwells, high-rises, tunnels, and ferry ramps. Volunteers learned where to report and how to help without getting in the way. The aim was competence that travels under pressure. Children who were infants then grew into adults who carry the story as history and as family. Some chose careers in medicine, service, and design because they had watched helpers work. Others entered journalism, law, or teaching to strengthen institutions. A few joined military or became firefighters and paramedics in the same houses where a parent once served. They brought new tools and also held values. They asked how to preserve openness while preventing harm. They learned that resilience is not a speech. It is showing up again. It is caring for neighbors and keeping promises when attention fades. Over time, unity frayed and arguments sharpened. Yet a quieter layer of respect remained. Voters disagreed about policy and still thanked responders at parades. Neighbors debated and still held doors. People grew tired of slogans and preferred stories about work. The country learned to let memory guide behavior without using it as a weapon. At best, the memory of 9/11 called people to be serious and kind at the same time. It asked for accuracy and mercy in daily conversation. It asked that public grief never serve private gain. It asked for steadiness when fear rises and for humility always. Care continues because the body keeps its own calendar. New diagnoses appear years after exposure, and the registry model helps connect dots. Screenings catch issues early and bring people into treatment with less delay. Therapists keep meeting survivors who rarely spoke about the day. Employers learn to accommodate appointments and fatigue. Families adjust routines around medication and sleep. Researchers publish updates that refine risk and improve care. The lesson is steady. Health work after 9/11 is not a project with an end date. It is a commitment to people. It is how a country proves that remembrance lives in action. In the end, the long aftermath of 9/11 lives in choices that look ordinary. People pause at the pools, wash hands after a clinic visit, and hold doors for someone moving a little slower. A firefighter checks a radio twice before a drill. A teacher prepares a lesson. A nurse calls back. A pilot reviews a briefing and smiles at a family in row 20. None of these acts can remake the past. They can honor it. They can keep harm from growing. They can steady the day. Care continues. The story remains open, and people carry it with care.